Hello out there. Good afternoon. Uh, Midday on the West Coast. Who knows what time elsewhere in the world? I'm David Blight. I teach American history at Yale University, and I edited a special issue of the New Republic back in September. Our three guests today were all authors in that special issue of 11 historians weighing in on the practice of history in the time of Trump. I want to thank Michael Tomasky, the editor of the New Republic, and Kim Blanchard, our helper and assistant and director of all things webinars at the New Republic, for putting this on, sponsoring it. And hello to all of you out there. The numbers are growing and growing. I'm going to quickly introduce our three guests, and we're going to get right at it on this issue, this question. As we posed it, Trump versus history, or history versus Trump. Our first guest is Ed Ayers, one of the most distinguished of American historians, known primarily as a historian of the South, but frankly, much, much more. He was a pioneer in digital history with the Valley of the Shadow Project, one of the first online history projects a lot of us perhaps even ever used, although Ed was using other ones before we knew what it was. A great scholar, author of The Promise of the New South, among other books, and then that two-book series in the Valley of the Shadow. Most recently, a magnificent book, just out a year and a half, called American Visions, which is a cultural history of the United States from 1800 to the Civil War. He did his PhD here at Yale. All of our guests did their PhDs here at Yale, in slightly different generations, if I can safely say that. And Ed, it's always a thrill to be on anything like this with you. Welcome.
Thanks, Dave.
Molly Worthen teaches, oh, by the way, I left out that Ed has taught at the University of Virginia, among other places. He was dean at UVA, and then he was president at the University of Richmond. So President Ayers has served at every level of this business we call doing history. Molly Worthen teaches at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her primary field is American religious history. She's also an important journalist, has written all kinds of op-eds in various places, and many of the best places a lot of us read. Her newest book, either just out or about to come out, I think it is, isn't it, Molly? Yes. It's called Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. No tiny little narrow specialized chronologies for Molly. And I must say, her essay in the special issue of the New Republic was especially provocative. Molly has had a lot to say about the nature of academia, the place of universities in our society, and especially the place of religion. And Geraldo, as he
Good job
to roll my R's, known to all his friends as Jerry Cadava, did his PhD also here at Yale back in my earliest years teaching here. And Jerry now teaches at Northwestern. He's a professor of American history and Latino American history, teaches courses, general courses and specified courses in Latino history. He's also a journalist of real note. He's now a regular contributor to the New Yorker. He's had a recent piece in the New Yorker about the crisis over ICE in Chicago in particular. His book, he's done two books, but the most recent and perhaps most interesting for this particular webinar is his book entitled The Hispanic Republican: The Shaping of an American Identity, American Political Identity. Jerry's also written a book on the borderland, the southern border of the United States, and has been around this question of immigration and its meaning in American culture and history now throughout his career. He grew up in Tucson, but was educated here in New England. Dartmouth and Yale, I think, wasn't it, Jerry? Anyway, now here we are. This is the second in a series of these webinars we've done. It's been simply an attempt to draw together historians of very different backgrounds and generations to try to respond to the kinds of assaults, attacks, criticisms that we've been encountering from the Trump administration and even before that. And so here we are, trying to use the tools we have, our pens, our voices, our rhetoric mostly, and sometimes our organization through our history associations. Ed has been the president of the Organization of American Historians, as have I. We both carried that burden. Our organizations can fight back in certain ways, but we have to defend our craft, our purpose, our ideals, our ethics, the very meaning of this thing we call history and how we teach it, how we research it, how we write it in universities. And now, I think, even more so in the schools, in the secondary schools, among teachers. And I know we have a fair number of social studies teachers in our audience out there today, thankfully. And welcome to all of you. I'm going to pose a very general question up front for all three of you. And then we're going to come around to those essays you wrote, which each of which has its own big themes. But right now, what is your personal take? When you get up in the morning, you go about your work. Maybe it isn't the first thing you think about. But what is your personal take on how our craft, our profession, is responding to or needs to respond to this, frankly, to overuse the word, unprecedented affront to what it is we do and how we do it? Ed, would you like to go first?
Not really, but I will since you called on me, David. So I think what we see are converging crises in higher education, but also journalism, but also K-12 teaching, and also public history. And if there's any benefit to those converging crises, they've revealed a historical community increasingly aware of its common purpose that I'm not sure we've always had. I hear more and more conversations among those different kinds of groups trying to be allies to one another. You and I both know the OAH struggles. How do we reach out to K-12 teachers in a meaningful way, right? And the AHA has done the same thing. And, have academic historians always been of the best help to the National Park Service? Have we always been great allies to journalists? But for different vectors, each of those sectors is undergoing its own crisis. And so I think maybe this is a time for some people to get over themselves a little bit and to think about what we share. So, I'm kind of famous among my friends for being stupidly optimistic. But I really do believe that because we see it all the time. And in fact, this webinar is an example of it, right?
Yeah.
That we're stepping off the rails that we usually have stayed on. So I think that, that I don't know who said it, but somebody said Americans always do the right thing when there's no other choice. Well, I think those of us in American history will do the right thing and find this common purpose when we're confronted with these common challenges.
Well, that's great. And Ed, you are known as a very hopeful guy, and not without reason. I mean, you have shown us that even the darkest aspects of American history it can have meanings and lessons and maybe even something redemptive when we don't know it's coming. You put the word promise for instance, in your book on the New South. Not
An
everybody.
unlikely place.
Well, I know, and not everybody would do that. That's what I
Yeah.
mean. Great. Okay. Molly, what do you wake up in the day thinking about in this particular crisis?
I find myself thinking a lot about the human inability to make a modest, reasonable course correction.
Mm.
I have for the past 8 or 10 years been increasingly concerned about many of the dynamics in higher education. And I have a great deal of sympathy for many of the conservative criticisms of mainstream American higher education, and have been involved in some efforts in my state at my institution to work on these things. But I am concerned about what I think is in many ways an overcorrection informed by a bad faith set of rationales on the part of the Trump administration. And I think we're at a really interesting hinge moment, especially as we wait for the remaining few universities to respond to the Trump compact.
Yeah.
In my own state, a couple of years ago, we saw a kind of miniature version of this kind of dynamic when our state legislature proposed a North Carolina version of legislation that's been drafted in similar forms in other states, often called the Reclaiming College Education on America's Constitutional Heritage Act, or the REACH Act. And in our state, we had an interesting dialectic in which Republicans in the state legislature pushed for a fairly aggressive set of revisions in the curriculum of campuses in the UNC system. The president of our system convened faculty from across the system to respond to it in thoughtful, pragmatic ways. And in the end, the system instituted itself a set of kind of compromise reforms that I think ended up landing in a fairly moderate place. And at least in the short term, and many of the details have to be worked out, it is a small case study of the way in which a dialectic can happen in a way that's ultimately, I think, productive. But I'm worried that we may not see that unfold at the national level. And so much depends, I think, on how people within higher education use this as a moment to diagnose, why is it that this full force attack on academic expertise and the education we offer has been so politically viable? I mean, I think the crisis of Trump's attack on history is only possible because of the deeper and longer running crisis of Americans' trust in institutions of higher education. And so I wake up thinking about that bigger set of problems.
Great. And I want to come back to that question of trust in our own institutions and all institutions. Jerry, when you get up in the day, when you get up, you may be out in the streets of Chicago monitoring ICE. I don't know.
There's that. Yeah.
But what do you think about it when you think about the broader? I mean, you're still a relatively young historian. Did you ever think?
Thank you.
Face this particular kind of challenge? I don't know.
No, but I don't know that I didn't anticipate it any more than anyone here didn't anticipate it. But
yeah.
I think when I wake up and consider what my job is at this moment, I want to try in as many different ways as I know how to disseminate what I know about the history of Latinos in the United States in as many different ways I can. And I think we're all doing this. I mean, I do it in my undergraduate classes. And so that's an immediate point of connection with people who don't know a lot about Latino history, who I can teach about Latino history. I do it through my writing, and I see my colleagues doing it, by a really sense of urgent community participation in their lives too. And I think, so for me, I think a lot about how to make history meaningful to as wide a group of Americans as possible, from high school teachers to college students to community members, wherever they are. And I think that I don't, it's kind of an experimentation. I don't know who's listening. I don't know where people are listening, but I think all of us probably believe that we do the work that we do because it's important and it matters. And we, at some level, probably believe that the things that we know are things that other people need to know as well. And for me, part of it is also just that in this increasingly diverse country, I really want to figure out how to tell histories that will make everyone within its borders feel included within
Yeah.
the big project that is American history, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can
we-
elaborate more later, but I'll stop
Oh
there
yeah,
for now.
you will. I'm sure you will. I mean,
Yeah.
we are our pluralism. That's kind of one of the points of your essay.
Mhm.
And we do need to get up every day and realize that we went into this for a reason. Ed, can I go right to your essay? Because among the many things you argue in your essay is that, well, first of all, you have a great breakdown of memory, of the kinds of memory there are. There's celebration, there's commemoration, there's critical history, and so forth. But you make the point that when it comes to patriotism, that much contested term right now, because the Trump administration is demanding that we all get in line to teach patriotic history. The Heritage Foundation is providing them their guide on that. But you say, and I think it's interesting, that a democracy needs both coherence, a history that can form forms of unity, modes of unity. At the same time, it needs truth. These are your words, coherence and truth. I thought those were good choices. It needs truth wherever it takes you. So we need both of those. And you've done a lot of work. In fact, you went out and traveled the country to find all this vernacular history. It turns out those truths are so multiple sometimes. But would you elaborate a little on that need, that you call it the necessity of coherence and truth?
Yeah, since that essay, we had office hours at newamericanhistory.org and
Yeah.
lots of teachers.
Good.
And I find I'm humbled almost every conversation by just sort of the the purity of purpose and their sort of bravery. And one teacher said, we were talking about this, and she said, I teach very young children, and I want them to love the country that they are a part of. It's important for them to feel they have a place here. And if they can't feel they have a place if they don't love it. On the other hand, they can tell when I'm lying. You know, they can look out their door and see the facts that are around them. So the lesson I took from that is that this is not sort of high-flown theoretical thing, but it's the fundamental principle of teaching and of teaching American history. So I think, there's a tendency for those of us, who do Southern history, David, I mean, I've sort of made a career of studying the worst things in American history, just looking it into the face. And
You and Fitz Brundage have the darkest topics, I think, of all.
I'll try to write a darker book then, see if I can beat this. But the and it's tempting to think that that is the truth, that I'm going to pull back the rocks and show you all, the squirming things underneath it, and I've shown you the truth.
Yeah.
But that teacher reminded me that if you just do that and you don't give a reason for people to care, uh, that that is a destructive strategy in and of itself. And so that was my takeaway from all of this is that I guess I always just assumed that people would be patriotic, uh, but there's no reason to believe that a lot of young people coming up will. So, you know, but a patriotism that's just merely a facade, that is merely celebration, that's just fireworks and big ships and parades, is hollow.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
and so that was the lesson I learned from all that is that they don't have to wait till they get to college that I'm going to show them the truth, right? They're teaching this from the very first time that they're ever thinking about my family.
Mhm.
Where's my community? Where's the school fit? You know, and so if we want people to be invested in the country, they have to feel they have a stake in the country, and so I I was taken, I'm going to say taken aback, but I was inspired by that point is that before you can have truth, you need to have a reason to care about the truth.
I love that line.
David, I know you're the moderator, but can I jump in with a
Gary, go
follow-up
jump
question?
in. Yeah.
I wanted to know if you guys, I mean, I'm kind of inspired by Ed's comments, but I think anyone can weigh in on it. I've been thinking a lot about what exactly is the historian's role in the forging of national unity. Is that our job? I don't know that it is.
Mhm. Mhm.
And unity itself too. I mean, maybe this just isn't something I've read deeply enough about, but is unity, a sense of unity, necessary to the functioning of a democracy? I mean, unity in the sense that we're all pushing in the same direction, um, instead of something like toleration for difference.
You know, that teacher that I was citing didn't speak of unity, Jerry. She spoke of a reason to love, to believe you belong, right? I take that to be
Yeah.
multiple in its very nature, right? There is some part of this nation in which I believe. And I think and that's in some ways the problem with the current campaign. It's take it or leave it, all of it. Here it is, and throw away anything that seems problematic. I think that instead, making it a personal sense of here's why I believe that being an American matters to me, and it might
Mhm.
be something that acknowledges that we're not all in this together. It may set aside unity as a principle and rather look for some sort of connection, some sort of, to go back to David's holding up to the light, promise. What promise is this country making to me that I can believe in?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well,
Jerry, your question's really interesting. When I think about what I hope we do in our history department, I think in terms, I don't necessarily use the word unity, but I think there is a piece of this that is simply about conveying facts. And many of the, I think, attempts to reform from the top down the curricula of public universities has to do with this sense, which is not incorrect, that our students have huge deficits in just knowing what's happened in the country in the most basic sense. And in many ways, the pressure on institutions like my own, University of Florida, Texas, to introduce new courses that focus on American history, perhaps from a certain, critics might say from a certain ideological valence, is part of what I would broadly describe as the problem of the high schoolization of universities. So these are areas of knowledge that I think historically we would expect students to gain in middle school and high school. And in many states, on paper, they're exposed to these things. But the truth is that they do get to university and they don't have any familiarity with the founding documents. They have only the faintest and largely erroneous grasp of even a basic timeline, right? Just setting aside even questions of contentious interpretation. So it seems to me that part of what we're seeing right now is a bit of a battle, between different stakeholders on what the narrative is, and whether you can simply teach counter narratives without some sense of narrative. But
Right.
then beyond that, it seems to me that part of what we do in the humanities generally, and certainly in history, is try to cultivate, if not so much a sense of unity, but a sense of instincts a person has as a citizen. And core to that is an instinct toward empathy and good faith, and a sensitivity to the incredible complexity of another human being you're looking at, whoever that person might be, balanced with a sense that you share a common substrate of human nature. And to me, one of the most concerning developments in the humanities since the 1960s, and it's a development that I think has accelerated in the past 10 or 15 years, is a real narrowing of the aperture in how we think about human identity, such that the default mode that I think a lot of our teaching and research happens in now is one that takes our place vis-a-vis power dynamics as the core of what our identity is as a person, rather than the kind of complexity and often incoherency of what we think and believe as well as our cultural and material and social locations. I think there is a real tendency that we do convey to our students that the first analytical step is to sort humans into categories of the powerful and the oppressed. And that set of categories certainly has a place, but I wonder if part of what we were seeing and the response from outside stakeholders raises a set of reasonable questions about the narrowing of questions that we ourselves are asking and the questions we're teaching students to ask about what it's like to be a person and the complexity of that.
Well, Molly, you just reminded me of a book, and I know you like old books, and I'd like to come back to that too, because you make an argument for reading old books, which after my heart. But in R.G. Collingwood's book called The Idea of History, which probably nobody reads anymore, but it's one of those old-fashioned philosophies of history, I think from the 30s or 40s. He said, learning history gives you a trained imagination. And I remember underlining that and thinking, wow, that's a cool line. What does it mean? Well, actually, use the word instincts. Our imaginations do get enriched by history. They help us learn to ask questions. They help us learn to deal with ambiguity and the enormous complexity of human beings and the capacity for our evil and sometimes the capacity for our good and all that. But we are trying to give the tools of training one's imagination. High school level, junior high level, college and university level. Again, you didn't say it explicitly, but we all know that, although most Americans may not know, that 80% of everybody in a school in this country is in a public school, public university. Huge percentage of that in community colleges and so forth. And not in the most elite of universities that some of us are privileged to teach in, where background knowledge at day one is just not going to be the same as the people who went to the most privileged of high schools and so forth. Ed, I wanted to get you to at least comment quickly, and everybody else can just weigh in too, but you have that nice part of your essay where you point out to us that, and I have the numbers here, there are 240,000 historical markers in this country, and the number grows every month. The NEH, the National Endowment, which is now, so stymied and blunted by the Trump administration, has given out 70,000 grants to all kinds of projects over film projects, history projects, museum projects, exhibitions. It has led to this, you call it a cacophony of varieties of American historical subjects of all kinds, especially to that idea of the local museum, of the local exhibition, the small film that somebody gets to make their 15-minute documentary on this or that or this or that. And that's still out there, but it all needs support of some. I wish you'd comment a bit on that, because you went out and found a lot of this.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about what might survive a sort of a top-down assault, it may be that the democratic vision in those places is more likely to survive than the most obvious institutions, right? I mean, do I think that we're undergoing a direct and powerful threat to historical understanding? No doubt about it. And the great damage is to individuals. I know many people, some quite close to me, who had NEH grants taken away at the last minute, and watching my own state historical humanities foundation suddenly eviscerated by this funding. And yet I've been struck by that they've not given up and how that they've looked for other ways to do it. We worked with a middle school class that put up a historical marker in Cumberland County, Virginia, about a Black community that had been replaced by a state park. And they invited me to speak, in the church, in this small community, as they were unveiling this historical marker. And people were crying in the pews as they're discovering this lost history. We all drive by historical markers all the time and not look at them. This one, you saw people gather around, have a picnic, and recall that. And that's going to be there for a very long time. And it radiates a kind of meaning. So this is not just, blind optimism. It is, and you mentioned my wife and I traveled to 60 historic sites in 27 states to see how history from 1800 to 1860 is remembered. And we, went in, okay, how's this going to be? And over again, people were just brave and telling the truth, but explaining to children these really hard things in ways that I was just stunned by. So, there was a time in the 80s and the 90s that we were so struck by all the obfuscation and outright lies of local historical memory. I guess I found everywhere I went, people were telling the truth in ways that were very heartening. So I think it's not just romanticization of that. It is, it's the books that we've been writing for the last 60 years
Yeah.
turn out to have mattered. It turned out that people have read the parts that relate to where they are. And also just seeing what genealogists has done, genealogy, how that opens doors to history is also heartening. So, yeah, I've seen with my own eyes the good faith that those people are bringing. And I've also seen the conflicts. People are, okay, we want to talk about this put this sign next to this Confederate monument and watch the fights over. It's kind of like Molly was saying about uh, the democratic conversation actually leads to greater insight on both sides. So I think we're stronger than it seems because the headlines are all about the top of the story. The roots are deeper than we might believe.
And Jerry, in your essay, you made quite a case. Well, a direct case. These roots are very old. I mean, Latinos have been in this country a very long time. And then you show that this is a history that has grown and then, of course, exploded in the past 40, 50 years, as Ed suggests. And you'd be hard pressed to just somehow find a way to banish it now.
Hmm.
I,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you elaborate a bit on that. And
Yeah.
yes, it is one field, Latino American history, but it's vast and complicated and comes in many different forms and regions. And go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Latino history is probably the case I know best, but I'm sure there's a case to be made for lots of other histories as well. I was thinking when Molly was talking about I can't remember what you called it, the middle schoolification
The
or high
high
school,
schoolization of college.
the high schoolization of college. Yeah, and just like the things that people don't know when they come to college. I mean, there was a joint project between a advocacy organization called Unidos US and the Johns Hopkins School of Education to study how Latino history is being included in K through 12 high schools. And I learned while writing about this project that there's a real debate among high school history educators about um, inquiry-based education
Yeah.
versus just content delivery, And I think I know in Chicago, the social studies program here, they do run a kind of inquiry-based education. So it is about the development of critical thinking, explorations of the relationship between yourself and your community. And I'm sympathetic to those things, but I think, the critique of the inquiry-based model is that students aren't actually learning the things they need to know, but just content. I mean, dates, facts, incidents, episodes of American history. Um, I was interested in that project because part of what they found is that I think the figure they came up with was that like 87% of high school history textbooks don't do an adequate job of including Latino history. So they might include the US-Mexico War, they might include the Spanish-American War. Maybe they'll talk about Cesar Chavez, but they won't talk about it in greater depth than that, in more nuanced terms. It's just very episodic. And to me, the thing I grew interested in is that 40%, 50%, 60 or 70%, depending on where you are, if you're in Texas, Los Angeles, or Florida, of K through 12 students are Latinos. And this is, I think, getting at part of what Ed was saying. I mean, to me, it's important that those K through 12 students feel included in the story of what America is. And I think that, what's heartening to me is seeing the hunger and kind of appetite for Latino history in my case, but I'm sure this applies broadly, the hunger among high school teachers and instructors for the inclusion of a really diverse, complicated American history. You know, they want it because their students want it. It's not that they're trying to impart some ideological bias or positions, that their students want to know what their relationship is in the United States, what their relationship is to the United States, how they belong here. And so to me, part of inculcating the kind of civic identity that we've all been talking about is by helping as many people who live here as possible feel included in this country, feel like they're part of the American story. And so to me, that's not even ideological. It's just kind of, you have 330 million, 350 million people here. Many of them are newcomers. 20% of them are Latinos. They should understand how they came to be here, And I think in the essay, what I was trying to do is, I think, the administration has all sorts of ambitions to remove diverse histories from public education, from all forms of education, in the name of some narrowly construed version of unity. But, I think what I was trying to get at is that the horse has already left the barn in some ways, like the people are here. They want to know their history, and no matter how much the administration tries to impose some other narrative of history on top of them, they're here and they're hungry for it. So
Well, since you're using that word hunger, I can't resist, Jerry.
yeah.
Nice job. And for those who haven't read it yet, which is probably most people, you do a lovely opening about Samuel Huntington and Richard Rodriguez. And I've always loved Richard Rodriguez's memoir, Hunger for Memory.
Yeah.
Even back, everybody hated him. He was supposed to be a conservative and all that. It helped me write about Frederick Douglass, to be honest. But you set that up. Here was this attempt by Huntington to preserve, well, you should tell it. He's trying to preserve a Anglo-Saxon vision of the United States. And there was
Yeah.
Richard Rodriguez all along saying, America's really brown. It's been brown for so long, and there are all kinds of brown. Anyway, which was the title of his book.
Yeah, it was too,
because I thought
well,
that was
now that you're, yeah, I was actually in the intro not referring to Hunger of Memory, but his one, I remember it so well, David, in your Civil War and Reconstruction lecture class at Yale, you kind of made a joke about how Frederick Douglass has written 3 autobiographies or more, someone who just keeps revisiting their lives. But Richard Rodriguez is one of these people too. He's written 4 narratives. I mean, maybe he even tops Douglass there.
He never stopped writing about himself either.
Days of Obligation, Brown, and Darling, and he's evolved, And one thing that might actually be an interesting parallel between Richard Rodriguez and Samuel Huntington, and the Samuel Huntington book is called Who Are We? He wrote it in 2004, right? I think it may have been the last book he wrote. I don't know, but it was a kind of musing on American identity and the origins of American identity, and he really means it in a kind of non-derogatory meaning for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, but he uses that term to describe the origins of American culture. But actually, in Richard Rodriguez's first memoir, Hunger of Memory, he's really arguing for the acquisition of English as a manner, as a way of integrating, So he's kind of pro-assimilation. And even in Brown, I think, it's not that he's against assimilation in Brown, but it evolves in that, he wants an appreciation of all of the diversity that the United States is in that. So he kind of, go ahead.
No. I mean, well said. We don't have to call this unity. We can just say that one of those insights Rodriguez had, I thought, was this idea that so many Americans have lived at least a 2-life life, maybe 3. You're from there, now you're here, but then maybe you're going to be there later. I mean, the mobility of this society, all the migrations, a 2-life life. That was, his was Mexican and American. That's most of us in so many ways. Now that may be unifying or it may be conflicting, but it's part of who we are,
It's
I'm
interesting. I feel like
actually,
we've used,
Go
yeah,
ahead,
go
Molly.
ahead, Molly.
well, it's funny. I'm teaching an excerpt from Hunger of Memory tomorrow in
My God.
my honor
We did not
seminar
rehearse,
on
ladies and gentlemen.
on modern
Mhm.
American intellectual history, and it's the part of the memoir where he talks about his tension with the Chicano student activist organizations
Yeah.
and how they come to him and they want his involvement, they want him to be a mentor, and they come away really disappointed because he
Yeah.
doesn't have exactly their narrow and politicized understanding of what his identity ought to be. And it seems like it's pointing us to the kind of two-way street of what we want to when we talk about belonging in our
Mhm,
curriculum and the
mhm.
kind of civic duties that our teaching has. On the one hand, absolutely, you want to expose students to the stories of as many different kinds of people who live in this country as possible. Although, there's always the practical limitations of what you can do in a semester, right? I often think that these conversations get abstracted from the practical constraints that we're all under. But on the
Right.
other hand, there's the way in which you want to bring all kinds of students from all backgrounds into the foundational texts of the country's political system, into what is unfashionably called the canon, and convince them that that's their conversation too, and that there's a reason why, if you look at so many of the kind of titans of the history of American liberalism, Jane Addams, Martin Luther King Jr., they were products of great books educations, and they were convinced that those were their books, that those books were not just for people who happened to look like the authors in some totally superficial way, that there is this set of persistent questions about the great existential challenges of being a person. And there is a particular history to our democracy and the structures we have, and the imperfect ways in which we manage these questions. And it doesn't matter what your background is, that's your conversation too. So it
I
seems
think
to
that's
me
right.
that
I
as
mean,
teachers, we need to
yeah,
balance the two.
I totally agree with that. But the only little thing I'll say about that is that these foundational texts, even at the canon, has always been more diverse than the people who talk about great books courses have made it. So I think, when you think about the American Revolution, I know in Latino history, there's a guy, Bernardo de Galvez, the territorial governor of Louisiana, Spanish Louisiana, who's had a little bit of a revival, I guess, lately, at least in terms of public awareness, because, he helped arrange the financing of the Battle of Yorktown. So people have made a big deal of how, like, the Spaniard and the Spanish were kind of pivotal to the outcome of the
I
American
never
Revolution.
learned that.
What's that?
I never learned that.
Yeah, well, I just mean like there, and he wrote a lot of things, and there were a lot of, Spanish
Yeah.
philosophers in Texas who wrote things related to freedom and liberalism and individual achievement, things like that. So I think that they should also be included in the canon. That's all.
Yeah, and Jerry, before I let Molly defend her essay,
Mhm.
you also you had the courage to simply say it in your essay that Trumpism's attack on history may just be the last stand for white supremacy. I mean, you went
I've
there.
wondered that.
What's that?
Yeah, I've
Yeah, no,
wondered. I've
I
wondered.
mean, you didn't coin the phrase, but it's there, and reflect on that a little bit. I mean, there is a sense here. I mean, if you read the stuff coming out of the Heritage Foundation, their weekly essays and their newsletter and so on and so forth, it is frankly a white nationalism, and there's a desire to return this country to some kind of Saxon white Christian identity.
Yeah,
Part of our
I'm
many
actually,
identities, but only one.
yeah. I mean, to me, it seems like it can't only be a coincidence that we're having all of these debates in a
Yeah.
decade when it's now national news that a majority of the babies born in the United States are non-white babies, and that the percentage of Latinos in the United States is growing. It's just, it feels to me like that's part of why we're at the kind of inflection point that we're at. I mean, I don't know. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts about this, but I've often thought that we'll kind of return to the period between the the civil rights and Obama's election as a discrete period in American history where we told ourselves that, our nation had finally fulfilled its promise as a multiracial democracy. But then we saw the rise of the Trump years. Clearly, there was a lot of feeling bubbling up under the surface that kind of reemerged after 2016. So I think we're in something new. I mean, maybe it's race, maybe it's something else, but
Well, it's in part race. I don't know any way around it, but Molly, since those years is that period of years that Jerry just identified is the period of years that you argue the American Academy didn't go to hell in a basket by any means. The explosion of knowledge we've had in our universities, and for that matter, across curriculums into the schools, secondary level, and even earlier. But you make the case that so much of what scholarship became, and therefore teaching, became about a kind of cynical critique. Those are your words, a cynical critique of this thing, this American experiment, our history, and so on and so forth. I think you're onto something. I think it's something that many academics don't like to talk about much or face if they don't have to. And I'm part of, we're all part of these revolutions that occurred in Black history, Latino history, Native American history, women's history, God knows. All the new histories have so enriched, so changed how we see America. That's what's being attacked about what's happened to American history. But you're suggesting we should also look in the mirror, I think.
I think it's always, as historians, we have this instinct, which I think is a good one, to take the long view. And so, of course, many of the dynamics that we are noticing have a deep history, right? You can go back in my own context in North Carolina more than a century and find conservatives in the state referring to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as Red Hill, right? That den of communists. And there's a sociologist named Neil Gross who has done I think the most in-depth study that anybody has done of the long-range political preferences in the academy, broken down across different kinds of institutions and across disciplines. It's called something like "Why Professors Are Liberal and Why Conservatives Care," something like this. And it tells us that the mismatch between the ideological spectrum within the academy and the public at large is a long-standing one, but it has become more extreme in the past couple of decades. And I think your summary is right, that there is a particular turn that has perhaps gobbled up more of the intellectual bandwidth in the humanities than it ought to have in a balanced ecosystem. And I think this is complicated, and it has to do with the broad history of sort of civil religion in America and the way in which I think the secular liberal elite who set the agenda for our main research universities really drafted off a Judeo-Christian heritage and a sense of moral mission that was perhaps informed in a way that we underestimated by the context of the Cold War, to give us sort of coherence and a moral foundation to the secular, liberal, pluralistic, democratic project. As it evolved after the 1960s and the very, I think, morally responsible questioning of the narrowness of the teaching and research at universities, the sense that there are huge swaths of the human experience that needed scholarly attention and needed, kind of to be brought into this conversation. But there's a way in which that worked in a way that I think we underestimated because there was this subfloor of confidence in the moral purpose of the American project for all of the attenuation that continued to build up through the Vietnam era. But I think that this drifting in the humanities from a confident sense that we are really teaching values, that we have something to tell students about ultimate goods and, who they should be as people. I think it coincided with institutional shifts, the explosion of what I'll call vocational majors in higher education, which I think have siphoned away our students to a greater degree than the hard STEM majors have. And as a consequence, I think in the humanities especially, we've suffered a kind of crisis of purpose, a crisis of confidence in our value to the institution, in our value to students, our place in the prestige hierarchy of academia. And in that context, I do think that some of the kind of theoretical fashions really coming from the headwaters of Foucault, but not only Foucault, who was, by the way, himself someone who had read the great books and was, formed by the very narrative that he's critiquing, which is, I think, why his critique was so rich, because he knew the narrative, he knew the texts. But there's a way in which I think we have been a little bit overtaken in the humanities by certain methods that focus on deconstruction and hermeneutics of suspicion and a deep cynicism that I often find in practice really collapses the complexity of human thinking and the relationship, the dialectic between our ideas and our ideological pictures of the world and our reality. I find just so often that the dominant assumption is that are the life of the mind, ideas as they surface in our primary sources are really most interesting if you can sort of peel them away and expose the power apparatus underneath. And undergraduates eat this up because there's nothing an undergraduate wants more than to feel sophisticated and to feel that he or she has one over on the text on the table. And so this claim, which I think undergraduates kind of absorb a simplified version of, that what it is to be an intellectual and a sophisticated, informed person is to see the bias, is to see what's really going on and the power grab that really is motivating the creator of this text. And once you've done that, you don't actually have to take the argument seriously. You don't have to do the work of getting into the worldview. It's very powerful, and it has these kind of anti-intellectual consequences that I don't think any of us anticipated. So I see part of what's happening as just another chapter in the kind of historiographical pendulum swinging. I think this is what we do as historians. We get a little bit too far down one road and in love with one set of methods, and then we are, sort of pushed back sometimes by pressures outside of our total control or approval. And maybe that's part of what's happening right now.
You can currently take a 2-semester course on Foucault in the American Studies department at Yale. Now, I don't criticize what my colleagues teach, and I don't mean that necessarily as a criticism, but it's 2 semesters on Foucault in the American Studies. I guess it is a criticism, sorry. But yeah, and by the way, I'm going to begin slowly to move into our questions, which are piling up here in Q&A and all kinds of comments in the chat. But Molly, one quickly for you, and then I'm going to move to Ed and Jerry too. This one comes from David Scott. It's kind of a direct question for you, Molly. Molly, will American Christianity help us get out of this quagmire that white Christian evangelicals got us into?
Wow, that's a very pointed question.
Yeah.
Christianity is like every set of ideas that's ever graced the face of the earth, and that humans have used it and operated in it to do great things, and they've operated within its confines and used it to justify terrible things. So that's just number one. I think that there are some interesting dynamics going on within what I really see as the diversity of American Christianity that do give me some optimism. I mean, one is the browning of fairly theologically conservative Christianity in this country. And, this is a phenomenon that got interesting media coverage about 10 years ago. And there was a great deal of excitement among secular liberals that, as a greater proportion of American Christians are Latino especially, but also from other parts of the country, that, surely they will all vote Democratic. And that turns out to not be happening at all, because traditional Christianity does not actually fit neatly into either party platform. But I also see among my undergraduates a real wrestling with the legacies of the Christian right, and the way in which certainly there are conservative Protestants who have been very guilty of an idolatry of power. And a desire to avail themselves of the breadth and depth of the Christian tradition. I mean, I think rightly understood, Christianity, I mean, it didn't begin as a Western white religion, and it is not a Western right religion today. Demographically, the center of gravity is the global South. There's absolutely no question if you look at the maps.
Africa.
And you can't really get away from that. And so, there's a way in which there is a sort of gravitational pull out of the Christian nationalist narrative. This is a way in which the secular media has really misunderstood Christian nationalism, especially when reporters have focused on these independent charismatic churches and cast them as Christian nationalist. These churches, you may have all kinds of objections to their cosmic worldview and their interest in using the levers of political power, fine, but they are very international, far more international than most secular liberals I know. And their growth is outside of this country through these what are called kind of apostolic networks. And I just say that as a point of observation. So I think that, combined with the way in which this uptick we've seen among Gen Z, especially Gen Z men, in engagement with organized religion for the first time in the history of modern statistics, young college-educated Gen Z men are going to church at a greater rate than women. I mean, that's just never happened. In
fact, you make the point in your essay that one thing universities might learn from churches right now is maybe to concentrate on young males, because so many are in so-called trouble. And
yeah, concentrate on young men. Think about the costs of telling young men for a decade or more that being a man is toxic, and think about what that can do. But also, my point in the piece is that these churches that are growing, I mean, they're far from perfect, and some of these young men are getting politically radicalized and taking Christianity and turning it into a kind of tribalism. But I think what they're expressing is a real exhaustion with the sort of mainstream message from the culture about, where you find your identity, that you should do it alone, that you don't need institutions, that you don't need a tradition. And they're hungry for an alternative. And universities ought to be, at their best, a great countercultural ballast against the pressures of the market, against the sort of atomizing, individualizing messages from culture. And I think universities have done a great job at leaning into innovation, but they have forgotten all the things they're supposed to be conserving, and the way in which they are an institutional ballast and should recover that identity.
you mean we keep innovating in STEM, but we forget that there's a reason to read these old books? Yeah.
Well, I think that there's a way in which the STEM attitude toward the advance of science has crept into the humanities, such that my colleagues talk about certain ways of doing history, certain methods, as old-fashioned military history, old-fashioned diplomatic history. And often it gets elided with a particular political viewpoint, I think often unfairly. But the implication is that history is like physics or chemistry, and that, the field moves on. And there's certain ways of doing history that we don't need to revisit. Now, in some cases, that might be true, right? I'm not going to defend every historian who ever wrote in generations past. But fundamentally, it's imposing an analogy from the hard sciences onto the humanities that I think is inappropriate.
I'm gonna move to another one of these direct questions here, and Ed and Jerry, you can take a quick crack if you want. Larry Webb wants to know, should historians have a Paul Revere type role in warning the citizenry of currently pending and trending dangers to our nation? Now, that assumes everybody knows who Paul Revere was, but anyway, should we be the Paul Reveres of our time? Should we have the public voice now? Everywhere we can take it, warning that our democracy is at stake, our education is at stake, our democracy is at stake, our museums are at stake. Is that our role?
Ed, I'll
I
nominate
say
you.
Jerry.
I'm very generous. I'll defer to you.
Well, yeah, Ed, you've been at the top of an institution. You know,
Yeah.
the top to the bottom of this story.
I think maybe the analogy is less Paul Revere than the boy who cried wolf.
Oh, okay.
I think that if we just keep saying that over and over again without an alternative vision of what
Yeah,
things should be, rather
yeah,
than just leave us alone, trust us, I think that we need to have a more powerful message of, okay, here's what we would do instead. And so it's a reactionary movement,
yeah.
but we don't want to fall back into just being a reaction against the reaction, right? Look beyond the horizon. What should come next? I guess this is a place I might, I don't know, differ with Molly, but I do believe that there's a lot we can learn from the sciences, that there are new forms of information that we have not wrapped our minds around as historians. And obviously AI, hesitate to bring this into the conversation, but is a profound threat to the ways that we think. I guess I believe that we need to read old books, but we also need to read uh, the mountains, the billions of words that are in newspapers that have been locked away from us that we now have the possibility of
My
reading.
favorite source.
Yeah, so that's it. The Paul Revere, I would say, instead, I would give a clarion call for what's next. What do we do now other than just resist?
Yeah, and a lot of universities are, appointing committees and trying to, and I'm sure schools are, secondary schools are. How do we get outside of our boundaries in some new way? Not just the old ways, whatever they actually were. Um,
We have to be more confident than we are, I think, and to speak after this moment has come and gone, the universities will still be here. The
yeah,
museums will still be here, right? And so the thing is, how do we keep the pilot light on? How do we keep the sense of mission alive rather than just allowing it to be defined by, and the metaphors mixed by the current moment? Jerry, with that elegant transition, I hand it to you then.
Yeah, yeah. I think I don't mean to apply the sentiment to any particular conversation we're having right now, whether, a term like fascism is the right term. I don't mean to engage that particular conversation or any other number of conversations about particular ideas that exist in the present that we want to understand their history of. But I do think the only thing I worry about with this idea that like historians are the truth tellers who issue
yeah,
warnings about things we see in the present is that it seems like it could only encourage thinking that there's like a straight line between the past and the present, like just that you see this thing that happened in the past, and I'm warning you that it happened in the past so that it doesn't happen today. And I
yeah.
think stories of continuity above change, I think, are of the moment today. And um, I think sometimes when we look at the past, we should also be prepared to understand that even if it has some resonances, it was you know, people were very different in the time.
I find one thing that freshmen believe that the reason to study history is because history repeats itself. And
Right.
They've learned that. Good. Well,
and it's hard to explain how that's not really true.
yeah,
And
Yeah.
yet history is still meaningful. It's tricky.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
there's a question in here, and again, we can all. I'll say something quickly, but K. Tim Nielsen wants us to remember that uh, everyone with any smarts, she says, is not at Yale. Well, uh, Ms. Nielsen, I will be the first to admit that. I didn't go to Yale. I don't have any degrees from Yale. I just work here. My esteemed colleagues here do have degrees from Yale, mind you, and they shouldn't apologize for that. But yes, you're right out there that most people teach in places with huge teaching loads. Some are under surveillance. Some have to turn in their syllabi. Some are in situations where they're afraid about what they teach right now. Very good point here. And this converts to the secondary schools, perhaps even more.
Mhm.
Curriculums that sometimes teachers don't get to control at all, and they fight to control them. So this is also kind of what's at stake on a daily basis. I mean, I'll just say that to the question from Kim Nielsen. What's at stake here is, again, on this granular local level of how we actually get to teach what we know or what we've learned or what we can read. I've worked with a lot of high school teachers, as I know everyone here has. Jerry, you've done Gilder Lehrman Institute. Ed, you've done the Molly, you've worked with teachers. And it can be so moving to see the strength and confidence or just the desire that teachers have to learn something new about this and new about that because they didn't learn it before, and then find a way to go convey it. And frankly, so much has been done in recent years to democratize this profession, to democratize the subject, to bring new, I mean, Jerry, you've done Latino American History Institutes for teachers, and probably a lot of the teachers you get have never taught this, or they're looking for ways to learn to teach it. I've done the same thing with slavery and so on. But even then, we face this crisis because all these changes we've helped bring about are the problem for the American right. And I guess I'm hoping we can go to this question for at least our last moments. And Kim Blanchard, you will tell us how many moments you're going to allow us to still have. But our great audience out there is still with us. This is a political fight, is it not? And we historians, and this is not to denigrate our profession, but it isn't the first thing we were trained to do. In fact, we weren't trained to do that necessarily at all. We were trained to be teachers. We were trained to be scholars. We were trained about the ethics of research and knowledge and how to convey it. And we've created some of our own problems, as Molly has said. But this is a political fight, and we don't have the resources that our foes do. And I'd like to hear all of you on this point too. And there also, we have 2 or 3 questions here and God knows the chat is now loaded with dozens and dozens and dozens of comments that we can't really get to, but everybody I think can read that. People want to know how historians should be responding to the Project 2025. And of course, many of the executive orders by the Trump White House have been literally written. The language is taken right from Project 2025, including the now infamous or famous Executive Order of March 27, the one that said sanity and truth must be restored to American history. That's the one where Trump and his people laid down the gauntlet, declared war on what we've done to American history. So, you know, how do we fight back beyond our boundaries? Or do we just stay in our lane and comment when asked? How do you all feel about that?
I think a lot about what it would take to create the circumstances for an actual good faith conversation. I mean, being at a public institution, you know, and thinking about it in the context of my state, between stakeholders outside the university and those within the university about accountability. Because I have been disturbed by the attitude I perceive in many of my colleagues that which suggests to me that they're totally outraged by the suggestion that as employees at a state university, they should have any accountability to the people of the state. I mean, on the one hand, we owe so much to the freedom and the monastic independence that we have in our discipline. And we cannot do our work without a huge range of motion and a great deal of independence in our classrooms. On the other hand, I mean, it is a testament to how many people have an interest in how history is taught, that this very controversy is happening, right? And it tells us that this is not just our business, and especially for those of us who teach at taxpayer-funded institutions, we can't just resist, right? I think I worry about that being the headline, and that and we get into a sort of righteous mode where that is the tenor of any encounter we have with a state legislator or a trustee. I mean, I do wish, this is very banal perhaps, but I wish more of our trustees sat in on our classes. I think that probably most of the time they would be pleasantly surprised. And there's just a great deal of siloing, and we are in many cases debating a bogeyman rather than the person who is actually in the role that we have in mind when we think of the enemy. But we are at a place culturally, after so many years of polarization and the way social media has warped our media impressions of the landscape, in which we assume bad faith on the other side, and it has made these kinds of conversations virtually impossible.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Molly, all of it. My only question would be about responsiveness to the people in the state. That makes a lot of sense to me. But then does that mean in practice that we need to be teaching them the things that they want to learn in the way that they want to learn it? Or like how do you decide? Because
yeah, and you're highlighting the conflict between my crotchety conservatism and my resistance to the consumer narrative, right? Because the last thing I want to do is slide into that and just cater to what the consumers want. I think there's left-wing and right-wing versions of that are both terrible.
right.
I guess I think we should talk about things that we're actually especially conversant about, and perhaps not hold forth on the most sweeping generalization. So what I'm thinking about, two things. One, every teacher knows that we can create a community of trust in our classroom. If we know how to do that with sincerity, honesty, genuine openness to other people, I think there's more of that than people recognize, and I think it happens at every level of education. And that should be the first priority that we have, is create a place where people can trust one another to say what they believe. The other thing that I think is that state curricula, local school boards, um, you know, local teachers, those are the places where I think we can make the biggest difference. What I worry about is so often we're just talking to each other. We're persuading each other of things we already believe. And I think, go somewhere where people don't agree with you. And maybe sometimes it's your own classroom, right? So I think there's more, as Molly said, if people would actually come into the classrooms and listen, they would be heartened by the humanity from all sides that they see there. So I think, speaking about things we have some right to claim credibility on.
Indeed, we're not experts on STEM curriculum, and we're not, well, I'm no expert on AI. I don't have a clue what's going on with it, but Jerry, can I get you to comment real quickly on one thing, and then we'll take this out. Do you think has there been for you anyway, any change in that question of ethics of how we handle our classroom, or for that matter, the public platform? Now, the public platform is not quite the same thing as the classroom, but in this political moment, with history under attack, with Latinos of all backgrounds living in fear, literal fear for their lives, their families, their homes, has it changed in any way the ethics of how you treat this question in the classroom? I mean, I don't want to just pick on you for this.
No, no, I've thought a lot about this. I mean, but I don't know that I have a very clear and generalizable answer for different reasons. I mean, at Northwestern, I might be comparatively protected to have, teach my class on Latino history in the way that I've always taught it. I haven't changed my syllabus. I mean, Northwestern, probably like many universities, we very quickly got calls from the administration that we had to scrub lots of language from our websites. Anything related to DEI programming or anything like that. The thing I've been thinking though about Latino history and Latino studies in particular is like I understand that there are some perspectives within the field of Latino studies that like decolonial thinking or something like that, decolonial thought, decolonization, that would be kind of ideologically charged. But I can't get around the idea that there are still 60 million Latinos in the United States who have a history that needs to be told. And so I think I've always done that in my classroom. I don't think I've taught it with a particular political bent, but I do think that the people are here and their history should be told. That's it. That's how I've approached it. Just I haven't seen like, yes, I understand. I don't know that these questions are answered yet, particularly well by the administration, even because, for example, like in the Smithsonian thing, when they make pronouncements against the National Museum of African American History and Culture or the Latino Museum, they'll say things like, well, we think there's an overemphasis on slavery, or we think there's an overemphasis on immigration. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about immigration or that we shouldn't talk about slavery, even by their own language. It just means that they think there's an overemphasis. And I would like to ask them, well, what should the emphasis be? You know, because, and I think the way I'm trying to connect that to my classroom is that, you know, histories of immigration, histories of civil rights, histories of, you know, assimilation, political inclusion, whatever. Those are just histories that need to be told. You know, and I think of course, they're inherently political topics, but in order to understand the history, you have to grapple with these subjects.
Well, indeed. I'm going to give each of you a very brief last word, but I want to say something quickly here. We've had a number of questions here about how historians are responding to Project 2025 and so on. And one questioner says it's certainly whatever seeped into how K-12 social studies has to handle history and so on. And to Ed's point about how we have to sometimes talk to people we know we disagree with, I have challenged Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, for anyone out there who doesn't know, to a series of 2 public debates. He has agreed. First is going to be in February. And by the way, Mr. Roberts is a PhD in history. He wrote a serious dissertation on slavery in Louisiana. He is a historian. Now, the Heritage Foundation, however, has been, in effect, working as the Trump White House's history department. They have prepared all kinds of executive orders. They have put out the latest thing, and Ed, you're going to want to look at this if you haven't already. They have put out a grading system for American historic sites. They started with 45 of them. They're moving now, I think, to another 45 sometime soon. And they give an A, B, C, or D, A, B, or C grade to sites based on their criteria. It's interesting. A lot of A's, but some C's. Anyway, and Mr. Roberts has agreed to debate a 2-on-2 format and so on. So we'll see. I don't know if this will work. It may be a bit of a debacle or a spectacle. It may be useful, but I have approached them simply in the interest of civil discourse. It's a term that Mr. Roberts has used himself many times, but they keep putting out direct critiques of our profession, and that's putting it mildly. I mean, they have attacked the Smithsonian boldly, and the practice of history boldly. They can't keep doing that without at least some response. And the best way may be to have a public debate and see what happens. But a last word from all 3 of you. Any last word you want to leave our audience with about we historians and how we might even be hoping to be remembered in this moment when the day comes. Jerry, you want to go first?
No, not really. But you know, I'll just say all I will say is I hope that there are more conversations like this because I found a lot of what you guys had to say very thought-provoking, and I'm still churning with some things that Molly said about an overemphasis on power disparities, but at the same time, the need for belonging and inclusion. And I'm in my own head, I'm trying to reconcile those 2 kinds of things. And so I think that these conversations can be helpful just because they you know, even among a group of historians, can take us out of our own comfort zone in productive ways. So let's keep doing this.
You know, even these Zooms can get us out of our little caves, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Holly, a final word.
I think we have a real opportunity here. I mean, there's been some interesting poll data out of the Quinnipiac University poll operation just in the last week or so, suggesting that in its compact offer to universities, the White House has overreached. Something like 57% of Americans say they oppose increasing the federal government's role in higher education. And this is interesting. Even among Trump supporters, fewer than half say that they support the compact for higher ed, which is really interesting. So I think we are at an inflection point where if we can act thoughtfully with enough introspection and be candid with ourselves about the ways in which the criticisms we receive have more than a grain of truth, and ask what can we do to begin to revisit and reshape our institutions and our practices if they need to be rethought, I think we could come out of this stronger than before.
Yeah.
And I think taking the broad view that we do, we're seeing reactions to reactions to reactions, right? The way history tends to move. I'd like for us to find a language that's not merely defined by the people who are critical of us. What's our own language? And I think Molly referred, to this very human language. I think that there's lots of places to find that. I don't find it in the criticisms that I'm reading about us. It doesn't seem to be a humane purpose. It seems to be a purpose to seize power. And in some ways, I think what we need to do is to seize humanity, to instill a sense of our students of the complexity and wonder of life, rather than thinking everything can be reduced to a critique.
Well,
That's good.
on that note is a good place to end. Thank you again to all three of you taking the time with this, the thoughtfulness, the seriousness. I think we've shown that historians are pretty serious, interesting, and sometimes even funny lot. So
Funny looking, but
well, whoa, here. Yeah, we do that too. Yeah, I need a haircut. I know. Anyway, thank you, all three of you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kim, for hosting us at New Republic. Thanks to the whole audience for coming. And who knows, we may do another one. There's still 4 more authors on that special issue that I haven't tapped for one of these yet. So, and they're waiting, so we'll see. Anyway, thank you everybody for coming.
thank you all.
Thank you, David.
Thank
Great.
you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.